Good evening, everybody. I'm Ed Epstein, president of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, welcoming you to our May program. Tonight, we welcome author Lois Romano, author of a new biography of Mary Todd Lincoln, An Inconvenient Widow. The book has been very well received, got rave reviews already in the Wall Street Journal just today, for instance, and other major publications are working on big reviews of it. We're honored to have her. The book will be officially published on May 19th, I believe. Our format, as usual, is that Lois will speak for about a half an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions, answers, and discussion from our members and guests with us tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming. If you're watching this online and you'd like to get information about joining the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, go to our website at lincolnian.org and click on the Join Now button on the upper right. We're a very active organization and we have members all over the country, and almost all of our programs are on Zoom, so no matter where you live, you can partake in our activities. To introduce Lois Romano tonight, I'd like to introduce our new Vice President of Programming, Jeffrey Boutwell, who himself is author of a recently well-received book, biography of George Boutwell, one of his ancestors, who was a little known but fascinating and very important figure in the Lincoln and Reconstruction era. Jeffrey, take it away.
Thank you, Ed, and welcome, Lois. Wonderful to have you with us tonight. Ed's already provided a partial introduction, but I'll just add that Lois is a national journalist who is an editor and columnist and reporter at the Washington Post and Politico. She's best known for her in-depth coverage of American political culture, where her reporting combined rigor, insight, and narrative clarity. Lois's interest in the lives of women who have influenced history informs her writing with empathy, depth, and nuance. As one reviewer, I believe, has said, An Inconvenient Widow, the torment, trial, and triumph of Mary Todd Lincoln reflects her insight into the interplay between politics and the human condition, illuminating the complex life of a First Lady who navigated personal turmoil and public scrutiny to play a central role at the most consequential moment in our nation's history. So we're looking forward both to the book and to the discussion tonight. Want to say a special thank you to Craig Howell for having distributed the Wall Street Journal review today to all of us so that we wouldn't have to navigate the paywall. And so it's a pleasure reading that today and now having Lois with us tonight.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you all for inviting me. Thank you, Ed, and I'm very grateful for all of you who have joined this conversation. I will go through a few things that kind of interested me, but I'm really hoping this will be an interactive conversation. I really want to hear from all of you, and I want to hear your questions. I'm very fascinated by Mary's story. And it's so complex and there's so many layers that there's so many things we can talk about. And sometimes I'll be talking about it and then I'll forget something and, say, wait a minute, do you remember the time she... So let me just run through a few things as a way of background and a couple of points that interested me. I get asked a lot why I did the book. And I've been long fascinated with Mary, and it started about 30 years ago when I was covering Hillary Clinton at the White House, and I've covered a little bit of Barbara Bush, not so much Nancy Reagan, and I covered subsequent first ladies. And what struck me about covering Hillary Clinton was how much she was demonized. It was just shocking to me. I was a mother of a 2-year-old at the time. And here is this woman who comes into Washington. She's an accomplished lawyer. She clearly helped elect her husband president. If you remember, they had sort of a slogan which did not serve them well, 2 for 1, and people did not like that. She was very interested in policy. She was actually much more disciplined than Bill Clinton. And I just couldn't get over how she was demonized and vilified. And I remember thinking, isn't this what we want our daughters to grow up to be accomplished, strong women. And so I did some research and I thought, well, who has anybody else been treated like this? And lo and behold, it was Mary. And the parallels were just extraordinary. They were judged not for who they are, who they were, but for their appearance, for being outspoken, for their intellect, for their tone of speaking, for their influence. I mean, both women were reviled because they were perceived to have influence. And I got a kick out of this because Hillary was very involved in patronage. She knew she wanted to take care of a lot of people, that, Bill was a lifelong politician. And so was Mary. And it drove men in 1861 just nuts. And I felt that, and so I just kept reading about Mary, basically. And the more I read, the more I thought this was a fascinating and a tragic story. And I didn't have time to really write a book back then because I was raising children and covering things and stuff. But a few years ago, I remember thinking, I left the Post in about 2017 and thinking, I want to do an interesting project. And I met with an agent, and he was very interested in Lincoln, and he was very interested in Mary's the trial, the commitment trial that Robert engineered. And he said, why don't you do a book on the trial? And I said, I think there's a much more interesting story here. I think this story I think she needs a whole new look. And I think she was not treated well. I think history has not been fair to her. And I think there's a lot of things that we could write about. The next question that I think is one to ask is, how is this book different than, say, Jean Baker's? I think Jean Baker's book was a very good book. And it was a book of record. And the first thing I did is I went and met with Jean Baker in Baltimore, and she was supportive and lovely. What's happened since that book is a lot of things. A lot of things are more available, like digitization. So, for example, Jean Baker covered the old clothing scandal where Mary goes to New York under a pseudonym and tries to sell her clothes from the White House. Like there's something wrong with this. Who cares if she sells her clothes? Anyway, Jean covers it. She quotes a few newspapers. Jean would have had no way of looking up this digitally and discovering that 2,000 stories were written about that. It was extraordinary to me. Mary was treated like she had murdered somebody. Every newspaper in the country, very few newspapers defended her. The New York Times tried to defend her, but then they said they didn't quite understand why she used a pseudonym when she went to New York. Fair point. But she was excoriated. And then her son shows up at her door, and he has a complete meltdown and said, "You humiliated me publicly. This is awful. You have to do something." And I think she writes a letter to someone and said, you would have thought I murdered somebody. I mean, the way I'm being treated. It was just a horrible, horrible experience. And those are the things that I think when Jean was doing her book, she was relegated to microfiche. And so there's so much more available to us now to find, to triage, to make it more efficient. The other thing that's happened in the last 35 years is that we understand mental health better. We did not understand mental health 35 years ago. Jean concluded that Mary was a narcissist. I'm not sure Mary was a narcissist. I think she had a lot of issues that manifested as narcissism, but they were not narcissism because she wasn't a malevolent person. Narcissists tend to be malevolent, and Mary wasn't. She was just trying to survive. And when I read about, there's so many different things that Mary could have had. For example, PTSD was not officially diagnosed, I don't think, until the late 80s. And I think it was called some sort of trauma thing. There's no question in my mind Mary had PTSD. She lost 3 children and her husband shot in front of her. And I think that's what caused her break in 75 when Robert committed her. I think it was 10 years to the month that Lincoln had been killed, and everywhere she is going, she's seeing these things, these reminders of him. I think she was bipolar, which other psychologists have pointed out. The one thing that I'd not seen pointed out before that a psychiatrist brought to my attention when reading this, it was anxiety. That Mary had acute anxiety, and I didn't even see it when I was reading it as the mother of daughters with anxiety, and I have anxiety. When they talk about Mary's temper, it was anxiety. She would have an outburst because something wasn't going her way and she didn't know how to deal with something, and then it would blow over. And that's not a temper. That's just a volatility because she can't cope. So there's a lot more that we know about mental health, and a lot more access we have to archives and materials that were harder to find back then. So that's the second point I wanted to make. The next point, the thing that really fascinated me the most about this project, what surprised me the most, two things. One is how badly she was treated. It was just extraordinary to me that she had no one gave her compassion. She lost a child in the White House, and the newspapers and critics were wanting her to hurry up with the mourning. And yes, she grieved too long, and she grieved too ostentatiously. That's all true. But who are we to judge how somebody grieves? She had already lost a child. So I was fascinated by that. And I was also fascinated how little credit she has been given for his success. And it's a very tough thing, I think, for some Lincoln scholars to give her any credit, because in a lot of ways, Lincoln's deified, and she's been cast as this huge burden on him. But if you go back and look at some of the letters that were written, even by her detractors, even by men who didn't like her, like William Herndon, you will see this thread, this very common thread, that basically states he wouldn't have been president without her, because she had the drive. She was brilliant. She had political instincts. Lincoln had all of those things, but he was a depressive. He was ambitious, but he would go into funks, and she would get him out of the funks and push him forward. And there was a great letter or an interview that her cousin did, John Todd Stewart, where he said it was Lincoln's skills and her drive and instincts that did the deed. That's what the words he used was did the deed. And even Herndon said, who despised her, that she had really good instincts on people. And she also, when you read some of the things and letters that she wrote, she was on the money. Like she couldn't stand Seward, and Lincoln decided that he was going to make Seward, and it was a smart choice to make him Secretary of State, because he needed somebody from the establishment to have a position of prominence in his administration. And Seward was supposed to be the nominee and wasn't. But Mary had a visceral distrust of him, and she was right. Like, he was in office. I don't even know that he was sworn in yet, but a few weeks into Lincoln offering him the job, he wanted to resign. He wanted to pull back the offer. I mean, Seward did, because Lincoln wouldn't let him choose cabinet members. He said, "I want to choose cabinet members." He thought he was going to be the sort of shadow president. And Lincoln said, "No, you can resign." And then he wrote Lincoln the memo that he leaked to the press saying, "You haven't done anything yet. And, if you want me to do it, I'll create a foreign policy and a domestic policy." And basically suggesting to Lincoln that he could be the figurehead in the administration, but that Seward would be the president. And he started leaking things, and the press caught him. Some of the newspapers started editorializing against him. I mean, she had his number. And I had this, I always ask myself, I mean, we have a little bit of a glimpse of how much Mary nagged Lincoln about some of these things. We have it from some of her letters. We also have it from Elizabeth Keckley. But what if he was listening to her more than we know? I mean, she had his ear morning, noon, and night. And I mean, at one point he says to Nicolay, I think, maybe it was Hay, but he says, I can't let Seward take the first trick. And because he was really on his toes. And this is as early as March. I mean, right after he's sworn in. And then Seward starts operating behind his back, and back channeling to the Confederacy. So she had that nailed. And then she also was very suspicious of Chase, and she was right, Salmon Chase, and she was right about that too, because he challenged Lincoln. So her instincts were quite good. Where she got caught up a little bit is that she didn't take, it was hard for her to take the long view. She was impulsive. And like I said, she was anxious. So she just believed, if Seward's doing these things, well, by God, we should just fire him. And Lincoln just took the long view. And he was right, because in the end, Lincoln and Seward became very good friends. He and Chase never reconciled, and Chase really betrayed him. But her instincts were just solid. And so those were the two things that really, the lack of empathy for her, and also her contributions to his being elected, and also to to the government, and to the things she was doing in the White House that got no credit. Everything she did, if she went to New York to redecorate the White House, which I will concede she overdid it, but everything was just excoriated. So that was my third point. My next point is that I do believe she was probably the first thoroughly modern first lady. And I believe that and not because she was an activist, because she was not an activist. She could have been active in the suffrage movement, and she chose not to. Somewhere in there, she believed that she believed in the domestic sphere, that her job was to stay home and raise the kids and support him. So she was not an activist, but she was incredibly progressive in that she was going to get out there and support this war. And the best example I have, and there are many, many examples, is after Sumter was bombed, and after Robert Anderson came back to Washington, the major, he was a hero. They had a reception for him, and he's invited to go to New York and Philadelphia and be celebrated. She decides she's going to go with him. And that's an incredible thing to do. No other first lady ever stepped into a situation like that. She was stepping into a middle of a war, and she gets on the train to Philadelphia with Anderson, and it enhanced his stature to have her there, but it also enhances her stature, because she is now sort of a surrogate for the president. And we never saw that before. We saw first ladies that were entertaining and being surrogates at teas or at social events or at benign things that were happening. We never saw a first lady traveling with a general in the middle of a war. During that trip, she makes extraordinary public appearances. She goes to a clothing factory that had just been flipped into a uniform making company. She goes to encampments. She goes to all these different places. And the biggest thing she did, which just should blow everybody away, is on Sunday of this weekend, she goes to Beecher's Church, the abolitionist in Brooklyn. And everybody knows he's an abolitionist. And we've just engaged in a war where the North and the South are fighting over slavery. And she walks into this church, a very public situation. And I'm not even sure, there might have been a reporter there, but everybody reported it. And I think it was the New York Tribune that said, "Heads just spit." She knew exactly what she was doing. And that was an incredibly huge public statement. So that was one thing. The other thing is her interactions with the media. No first lady had ever been covered the way she was covered. There's something that triggered the media. I'm not sure what it was. Maybe it was because she was from a slave-owning family. Maybe it was because she was from the South. But the media were totally triggered by her, and they covered everything she did. And that August, she decides she can't be in Washington anymore. She needs to take a break. In addition to the fact she was feeling a lot of pressure, the weather in Washington, Washington for diplomats at that time was considered a hardship post. And because it was built on a swamp. So it was unbreathable. There's no air, the water's putrid. It's awful. So she goes to the Jersey shore, and the New York Tribune takes the incredible step of sending a reporter to shadow her. That had never happened before. First ladies were never stalked like that. So this guy, he writes about and she's trying to, at this point, she's trying to keep a low profile. Her son meets her there. And everything she does every day, she goes to lunch, she goes to an event, she attended a ball on the Jersey Shore. It's under the headline, The Movements of Mary Todd Lincoln. All the verbiage of these stories was very positive, looking elegant, socializing. But what was interesting about it is that was the exact headline the Herald and other newspapers were using to track the movements of the armies. And so they were ridiculing her very quietly. And the Chicago Tribune figured it out right away. And they wrote an editorial about it. And they said they're harassing her there. It's a great quote, and it's in my book. It's like they're buzzing into her windows, into her boudoir. They won't leave her alone. They're stalking her. And it just said, leave her alone. And that became a big problem for her. She could not breathe. And no matter what went wrong, it was blamed on her. One of the things that if you all probably remember when she decided, or she was one of the people that decided to have this ball in 1862 in the middle of the war. She was not the only driver on that ball. There were a number of people that were pushing her to do that, including Seward, who said, we're not doing enough for the diplomatic community. And, we should really do this and make it a very VIP thing and not just a big free-for-all. Lincoln could have quashed that, and he didn't. He could have just said, because she listened to Lincoln, and Lincoln could have said, Mary, we're not doing that. We're not going to have this ball. He was all in on it. But she got excoriated and ridiculed. And it wasn't even a good time for her because her two children were very ill. And she kept going up and down the back stairs between the ball and her two sons, one of whom died, I think, a few days later. So anything that ever went wrong, she was accused of being an abolitionist, and she was accused of being a secessionist. The woman couldn't catch a break on anything that she did. So those are my reasons for saying she was an incredibly modern first lady. She said what she felt. The next point I'd like to talk about, and then I feel like I have been talking for a while here, but is Robert and her relationship with Robert. I take the view that two men destroyed her legacy, one that she hated and one that she loved. And they were William Herndon and her own son. And Herndon was just a disgrace, and nobody stopped him. And some contemporary scholars till this day carry a brief for him. And I find it just horrible because, and I know he's contributed to the scholarship, and I know a lot of what he's contributed is invaluable. But I also say to myself, how can we believe anything Herndon says when he lied so much about Mary? Like, he told a story in a lecture and also in his book that Lincoln stood her up at the altar, and that just never happened. Lincoln broke off an engagement with her, but there was no wedding. And he wrote this totally fictionalized account of a so-called wedding, and that all the guests were there and Mary was humiliated. And it was just fiction. And he made up, this is under dispute, but I think he made up a lot of the Anne Rutledge story. I think that obviously Lincoln and Anne Rutledge had some sort of flirtation, but his lecture was just a national disgrace. And then everybody wrote about it for years later. So he destroyed her legacy. And her son, and I don't know how people on this call feel, because I know there are some people that defend Robert. But I'm not a Robert defender. When I read everything, and I feel like I did two books. I feel like I wrote the book on Mary and then did enough research to do another book on Robert. I think he did everything in his power to harm her, to undermine her. Um, I don't think she needed to be committed. She needed help at that moment in her life. I think he completely rigged that trial, which some people have been hesitant to say. He made his mother walk into a courtroom where there was a jury and a judge in a filled courtroom. I had one scholar say to me, "Well, you know how it was back then. You know, there was some buzz in the hallways that something big was happening, and so all of a sudden the courtroom was filled." And I said, "That's not what happened at all." I said, "Robert staged this whole thing. He had his father's cronies fill that courtroom. They wanted the result they wanted, and that was to put her away." And when you read Robert's letters, um, and I know there was some odd behavior that Mary had. I do think I take the position that she was on some addictive medications and hallucinating, but it's all his letters are about um, how she's embarrassing as us. What are we going to do when people are talking about her? And then the shopping, his obsession with the shopping, on and on and on, his letters about the shopping. At one point, he writes a letter to David Davis, who is a sitting Supreme Court justice, okay, who has to deal with this crap from Robert. And he writes this letter complaining that his mother is trying to buy another bonnet, but that she owns 7 bonnets and that most of those 7 bonnets haven't been worn. Who cares about the 7 bonnets? And he's in this weird obsession about her spending. And the interesting thing about Mary's spending that I discovered is that she never went into principal. She didn't want to cash those bonds. And the only time she considered cashing them is when Robert asked her for a loan. And then she decided she didn't want to give him the loan. So she said no. But the second they got their inheritance, he wanted some money from her. She spent the interest, and all she was doing is filling a void in her life. It's now actually a diagnostic thing, compulsive shopping. She would go into these stores and she would buy things just to have human interaction. And she would take the boxes and bring them back to her hotel and put them in a closet and never open them. She bought curtains for a house she didn't own. She bought jewelry that she would never wear. She bought dresses that she would never wear because she only wore black frocks. And he was just so obsessed about his aunt actually called him out on it. And she said, "Why don't you just let it go?" And he just said, "I can't. She's going to impoverish herself." Unlike Jean Baker, I don't believe Robert was after her money. Jean Baker believed that Robert was after her money. I don't believe he was after her money, but I do believe he was terrified she was going to spend all her money and that he would have to support her. The other thing that drove him insane were the spiritualists. Again, who cares? The woman lost 3 children and a husband. And so if going into a room and spending $5 to have somebody turn off the lights and tell her that her husband was sitting next to her, why would Robert care about that? It drove him nuts. And I think those were the 2 reasons he engineered this commitment proceeding. And my favorite story about Robert is that he engineers this whole thing. He gets her in there. He starts writing letters to people saying she's very happy. She knows she belongs there. He gets a little upset that he's getting some pushback in the press. So he asked John Hay to secretly write an op-ed piece saying how great the place was. I mean, he was just so manipulative. And then he goes on vacation and he figures, it's fine. Mom's put away. I'm fine. I'm just going to go because I think he was a bit of a dilettante. I'm just going to go to New Hampshire now for 4 weeks and just sit here in the sun. And the second he's out the door, Mary writes these lawyers, the Bradwells. Anyway, long and short, you all know the story, which I'm happy to go into detail with questions. But she basically gets herself out. So he's on his vacation, and all he's getting is letters from the director of the hospital saying, I really think we need to let her out now. This is getting a little embarrassing for me. I mean, everybody's editorializing, and she gets herself out in 3 months. So that's one of my favorite Robert stories. And then she just takes all her chips and her money and she leaves the country. The last point I'll make that was of great fascination to me was about mental illness generally and the double standard. And I will tell you, I do have an op-ed coming out on that in Time Magazine in the next few days, and how when their stories were written over the years, Lincoln's depression, or at a certain point, some of the scholars stopped calling it depression. It was depression, but they started calling it melancholia. It was depression. The man was going into a funk. He was taking mercury pills that could have killed him in the 50s because he was so depressed. But his depression became a sign of strength and compassion and vision, and hers became insanity. And I don't know how that happened. Well, I do know how it happened because women were just always hysterical back then. So she carries the burden of insanity for her whole legacy. And even though we know that Lincoln was depressed, it didn't define him. In fact, if it did define him, it defined him in a positive way. It showed, scholars, saw him as having strength because of this. Like, I'm just drawing a blank. The guy who won the Pulitzer, the great Harvard guy, David Davis. No, that was his name. You all know who I mean. Two D's. He wrote the Lincoln biography that won a Pulitzer Prize. Harvard
David Herbert
historian.
Donald.
David Bryan
That's right.
Davis.
That's right. And he described it as an incredible sign of strength, and maybe it was, but why couldn't that be Mary? I think Mary did have empathy because of what she went through, because of all the losses, but nobody gave her any credit for that. Anyway, I'm going to stop now because I've told you all the things I'm passionate about, but I'm passionate about a lot more. So I'd really like to take your questions.
Great. Thank you, Lois. That was fabulous. We have a lot to go over, I'm sure, in terms of both Billy Herndon and Robert Lincoln. I have several questions on Robert that we'll get to in a minute. I will start just by asking, what was the source of Herndon's animus towards Mary?
I don't know exactly, but I actually believe it's because she wouldn't give him the time of day. Again, Mary just didn't like him. They were the same age, and he was a brilliant guy, but he was a little bit of a loser too. He was a drunk. And Mary had a lot of decorum. And at one point, Lincoln had to bail him out of jail. And so Mary refused to have him in her house. And so she would invite, they didn't really entertain that much anyway, but when she would have dinner parties, she would never invite him. And then when she would have massive big parties, she still wouldn't invite him. And then a new clerk shows up who's like 18 or 19, and she welcomes him into the house. In fact, when Lincoln's out of town and with Lincoln's approval, he escorts her to events. And you can see this thread through Herndon's letters, how apoplectic he is that he's never invited, because he says that all she'll do is have the aristocracy there, and her nose is stuck up, and she just thinks she's so great, and he was bruised. He was bruised and probably hurt. And other than that, and he thought the kids were ill-mannered, but I don't know if he blamed that on her. He thought the kids were hoodlums, the little kids. He really, when they used to come to the office, they were very lax parents, as I'm sure some of you know, and the kids would turn waste paper baskets upside down. But Herndon carried this hatred with him for 25, 30 years.
In terms of the invitations, almost sounds like he was a bit of a jilted lover.
Yeah, I think he was jealous, maybe because they were competing for Lincoln too, maybe,
Yeah. Good. Let's move on to Robert. We have one question. Was a lot of the criticism of Mary intended to undermine Lincoln himself? Was he the real target?
At some points, yes, I believe that, because Lincoln, as we all know now, was a little bit slow on slavery. And part of it was he fundamentally initially believed that he didn't like slavery. He never liked slavery, but he took up Henry Clay's position on colonization. And he wasn't quite sure, if I have this right, that the races could blend in together. But he definitely didn't want slavery. But his position initially was sort of colonization, because he said that to Frederick Douglass once, I think. And also that he didn't he wanted to stop the expansion of slavery. So he was being very, very careful. But a lot of the abolitionists, I think, knew that Lincoln was slow, but she became an easier target. And there was some sort of obscure news coverage on this. And you can see there was a letter Ward Hill Lamont wrote, where he says, "You wait and see, the abolitionists are about to come after Mrs. Lincoln because of some of this stuff." So she got blamed for things that he was doing. So yes, is the answer.
Okay. John O'Brien asks for your opinion of the insanity file that was discovered in Robert's papers at Hildene.
I think that I don't know a lot about it, but I've read that I think it was a great file. But I think that Robert burned some things, and we know he burned some letters because we have witnesses. His granddaughter, I think, said he burned some letters. I think he removed things that made him look bad. When I read that file, I and the subsequent book that Myra Pritchard got published through that Jason Emerson took on, that communication made Robert look bad. It didn't make Mary look bad. I thought it made Robert look worse than Mary. I mean, she was just saying, please get me out of here. I pray God. I mean, I didn't think she sounded insane at all in those letters. She sounded pretty sane. And when it was Robert in reading those letters where he's trying to prevent people from taking her out, from doing this, from doing that, it was a great discovery. But I don't think it exonerated Robert at all.
Okay. Well, two good follow-ups to that would be what was the psychological basis for Robert's enmity towards Mary? And do you think he was at all egged on by his wife, who one of our participants feels, was not, did not care for Mary?
That's a good question. Both of those are really good questions. I think Robert's animosity, he was very close to her as he was growing up. I think he just got embarrassed by her. I think he was all about image and, a charitable way to say it was that he was protecting his father's legacy, and that's possible. But I'd never understood why he was embarrassed by her shopping. And again, when you read his correspondence, her fight for a pension even embarrassed him because he was saying she didn't need the money. I mean, why would he care if his mother's fighting for a pension? He thought everything was a reflection on him, that as the quasi man of the family, I think people were saying to him, why aren't you taking over her life and her finances? And Mary wouldn't let anybody touch her money. And so I think he thought that this was a poor reflection on him. And so to answer your question, I think it was perception and Robert's concern about perception. I just don't think at one point he says, she was a danger to herself. I don't think she was. I think he just wanted her off the street. She didn't get along with the other Mary, and that's true. And that could have been part of the problem. He says at one point, I'm having trouble with housekeeping, meaning they were fighting. And his mother was staying with him and he had to ask her to leave the house. I think she was critical of the younger Mary and how she was raising the kids. And I don't know why. I think she was a nag. Grown up Mary was. Jean Baker wrote with not a lot of proof that younger Mary was a drinker. And I don't know where she got that from and that Big Mary knew that. But there was definitely tension between the two women and he could have been egged on by her. That could have been I will say this, he wanted this problem to go away. He didn't want to be dealing with it anymore.
Okay. A couple of questions have to do with, did Mary have any kind of a strong circle of female friends that might have sustained her and protected her a little bit?
She did, while she was at the White House, and then she cut them off. And I've tried to get my head around this. I think a lot of it was embarrassment. So when he was killed, she brought a little group a little posse, I call it, to the White House. One was Elizabeth Keckley, who she was very attached to, but there was Wells, the Navy Secretary's wife, and there was a senator's wife who just fell out of my head, who she called for these people that night. So there was a rotating group of about four women.
Dixon.
That's Dixon, right? Thank you. And Dixon wrote an extraordinary letter outlining the entire night later for posterity. And that is really unbelievable about everything that happened, about how the carriage showed up at her house, and she hadn't seen Mary in a few months, and she was shocked. So she had that group. But I think what happened is at a certain point, she just couldn't live the life that she wanted to live. She didn't have the money to buy a house. She was embarrassed. And so all of her energy just went into Keckley. And Keckley became her sole girlfriend. But she was a servant and she was half African American. So it was not an equal friendship. And then Tad sustained her. So I think over time, and then when she went to Europe, she made some new friends because she felt at that point, and this is not unusual for people that go through an ordeal, they want to get away from the people that knew them during the ordeal. They want a fresh start. So when she went to Europe, she made some new friends. There was another woman I just remembered named Sally Orne, who was a very good friend, and her husband was a very wealthy guy, and they helped her with the pension fight. But she all in all isolated herself after he died, and she admits that later that she did.
Yeah. Okay. And one of our members asks about Elizabeth Keckley and what precipitated the break, and was Mary justified in tossing off a devoted friend?
Yes, she was justified in this case. I mean, in some other cases, I would say no, but Elizabeth Keckley was incredibly loyal to her. And part of it was because she was loyal to Lincoln and she believed that Lincoln helped her people. And Mary had promised her, Mary said, please come to New York with me so I can sell my clothes. Elizabeth shuttered her business and went to New York out of loyalty. And then when the clothes didn't sell, Mary asked her to stay there. She just said, I have to leave because she was getting the bad press coverage. She said, but keep an eye on my clothes. And Elizabeth stayed there and she was picking up odd jobs and she didn't have money. And she was staying in rooming houses. And Mary told her that if the clothes sold or if I get a settlement from the estate, which she eventually did, she would give her some money, and she did not. And that was very selfish of Mary. So Elizabeth was literate and she could see from reading the newspapers that the settlement happened. And she didn't send her a dime. And so she was approached by a journalist and asked if she wanted to tell her story. And it was treachery. I mean,
Yeah.
she said later that she had no idea that the letters were going to be published. But she turned them over for review. So yeah, Mary was justified.
Okay. Here's an incendiary question. Was Mary Todd physically abusive of Robert, her son, as she was to Abe and others? And if so, how and over what periods?
I see. I don't believe she was. I mean, the stories I read are hearsay, like that she ran out of, and again, it's Herndon, she chased him out of, I don't know if she was physically abusive to her kids. She claims she never touched them. Did she spank them? But that was normal. I mean, for that period, did she spank the kids? Probably. I don't believe she was physically abusive with Abe, or let me put it a different way. I don't know if she was. I haven't seen anything where there was an eyewitness that wasn't 95 years old that said her grandmother told her that Mary chased him out of the house with a rolling pin once. So I don't know. I've seen Michael Burlingame has written that. I don't know. I've never seen something that for me said it. In fact, do I think she yelled a lot? Probably. Do I think she had volcanic eruptions and yelled at Abe and the kids? Probably. I'm not sold on the physical abuse.
Yeah. Another question about parenting. When Willie died, Mary, of course, forbade further contact with the playmates, the Taft children.
That was
What
terrible.
did this say about her parenting priorities? Do you fault her for that?
I do, but I think she had this way of dealing with death. It was really a bad decision on her part because I don't think she was thinking about what it would do to Tad. all she was thinking about is that she couldn't have any reminders of Willie in the house. And the Taft kids, the Taft mother waited and waited to resume, and Tad wanted to see the kids. It was very, very sad. Um, and this is where Mary couldn't grieve and where she was self-absorbed. And look, Mary had faults. There's no question she had faults. And not letting those kids get together and keeping them, she could have let them get together and still not invited them to the White House, but
Right.
to prevent Tad from seeing them, which I assume is what happened. I'm not sure, but I'm assuming that would happen. I read that she didn't want them to come in at all. Well, I saw a letter, but then Lincoln invited the older boy to come in and say goodbye to Willie while he was in the coffin. So I think that was a bad decision, and I do fault Mary for that.
Mm-hmm. Getting back to the health issue and any long-term illnesses that Mary might have had, I'm really struck by your discussion of PTSD, and be interesting to have professionals look at that more closely. Losing Eddie, Willie, Abe, and
Exactly.
Tad in this less than 20 years, all three sons dying before they reached 20 years old. It's just an interesting question.
And also the
Oh,
fact that she has the breakdown exactly 10 years after the assassination,
mhm.
that she has the mental break, which is normal for people with PTSD. Anything could trigger it. So
Yeah,
I think it would be very interesting. There was somebody that did a study, but I think it could be looked at again.
yeah. Were there any mental health issues that manifested themselves earlier in Illinois, say, in the
Yeah, yeah.
1840s and
I think
50s?
there was a whole history of mental illness in her family.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a reference in one of Townsend books that the father was very high strung. And then we know about the half brothers that were abusing prisoners. Um, her full brother, the youngest one, who was born when her mother died, he was an abusive alcoholic. They had addiction issues. There was a lot of history in the family, and then there are some letters. From playmates, or I don't know, was playmates is too, makes it sounds too simple, but people who knew her in high school, what we'd call high school, that said she had the temperament of an April day. So she was manic. There's no question she
Mhm.
was manic. It'd be great, great, great. And then all of a sudden she'd be in the dumps. And that's why one study was done that thought she had bipolar. But we don't really see it. She managed to control it, which you can do. You can control mental illness when you're younger, because you have things to look forward to. You have a life, you have children. But as you get older, and particularly if you suffer loss, it's very difficult to control mental illness.
Mhm. A question just came up about physical injuries. Her fall out of the carriage, the famous carriage accident. Did that have any long-term effects, do you think?
I don't know about that. She did hit her head, and there are some people that think that exacerbated the mental illness. I'm not really sure. I think the mental illness was exacerbated by the losses. Um, by the time the war was ending, she was not doing well. I mean, that
Yeah.
the outburst she had, after Willie died, and going through the war and being worried that Robert was going to go into war. Her behavior at City Point was just, she lost all ability to control her emotions. She
Mhm.
had an ability to control her emotions for a long time, and Abe helped her control them. But by the time the war was ending, and that the scene that she made with Julia Grant and Mrs. Ord, and I have no explanation or excuses for that. I mean, she was in a very bad mental state by then.
Yep. What did you think of Sally Fields as Mary Todd Lincoln?
I'm going to admit something to you. I purposely did not watch it and I should do it now because I don't care now. But everybody would ask me that. And I thought, I'm not going to watch it because as I'm researching the book, all I will see is Sally Field. But I'd heard that she was very good from my friends.
Yeah.
And I need to watch it because I hear it's a very good film.
Yeah. I'll ask a question about the marriage of Mary and Abe. Of course, it takes two people to have a marriage. Do you fault Abe Lincoln at all for his behavior towards Mary,
Totally.
maybe
He was
especially
he
in
was
the
he was
40s
remote.
and 50s?
Yeah, he was never home.
Yeah,
He was
and
remote. No,
he enjoyed not being home a good part of
he
the
did,
time.
but I don't think it was to get away from her, which was some of his friends thought. I think he just liked being out. I think
Um,
he was ambitious. I think he loved traveling the circuit, I think that was sad for her, but I don't think it was to get away from her. I think that he was trying to make a name for himself. And he loved the camaraderie. He loved telling stories with the guys. That was sort of his thing. And he would travel all around and he was trying to make money. And all the some of his friends said, oh, she was trying to get away from her. But the indicator is that apparently, when trains started running, when we were getting into the later 50s, he did start going home on weekends when he could get home.
mhm.
So he would travel the circuit during the week and then he would take a train and then go back. Because there were trains that were going to Springfield. And I think it was a lot of hardship that she put up with. I mean, she had we're talking about Springfield was primitive. It wasn't like Lexington. Lexington was more upscale than than Springfield. I mean, she had to
Mhm.
get people in to like bring in the firewood, pump the water, and do all of these things. And there was livestock roaming the streets. Everything was muddy. There were paved roads in Kentucky. So he was just never home. And
Yeah.
then when he was home, he was half home. He would when he was in the house, he would read and just go into his own little world. And there are
Mhm.
anecdotes about this where she would say, "Oh, Mr. Lincoln, we're not ready to go to bed yet." He would just go off into space. So I think he was hard to live with.
Mhm. And certainly, as far as Mary goes, Congress was hard to live with, uh, both during the war and especially afterward. I'll quickly say that she wrote in December of 1868 to George Boutwell in the House and to Charles Sumner in the Senate to champion her request for a pension from Congress, which of course was a tortured affair for the next several years. I think Mary was horribly mistreated by Congress when it came to that pension as the widow of the commander in chief, blah, blah, blah. Your sense of that?
I agree. She shouldn't have had to fight 5 years for that. I think there were two things going on. I do think that they were a little flummoxed initially, the Congress, about, well, we've just never done this before. They just couldn't get their head around it. But a lot of it, I think they just didn't like her. And there was enough people, and it wasn't just Democrats. There were some Republicans that didn't like her, that were fighting it. They were making up reports about her. I mean, 5 years. But here's the great thing about this story that she never gets credit for. She set a precedent. And after that, that's why Mrs. Garfield got money. And that's
Mm,
why every first lady after them got money. The second Mary got it, then Mrs. Garfield gets killed. Gets killed. Then Mrs. Garfield, she's already smoothed it out. And then they decide, well, you know what, $3,000 a year sounds pretty puny. So let's give Mrs. Garfield 5,000 and we'll up Mary's. And then right after that, Mrs. Polk and one other person got it. I can't remember. So she till this day, widows get a pension because of Mary, and she gets no credit for that.
mm. Another
Jeffrey, I
question.
want to call out Rod Ross. Lois, are you familiar with our member Rod Ross, who has an intimate connection with Mary's Asylum?
No, Bellevue.
So, Lois, you haven't
Hi.
read the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society with my article about Mary's stay at Bellevue?
I might I might have actually read that and cited it in the book. We need to look at
Mm,
that. I think is that the whole medical report?
Well, the patient progress report really is
Yeah,
very
I think I credit you. I think I credit you in the book. I think you're in the bibliography. I'm pretty sure. I couldn't have written the book because I quote from that. So I'm sure that that you're in the book. Yes, I'm fairly certain that the book is in the bibliography and it's cited.
This could be the final question. I don't have any others after this. Is there any documentation of how, to the extent that Mary might have influenced Abe on policy issues?
Um, no, not directly. I think there's stuff where she would send people in to talk to him about things. And then we have some clip, some snippets of conversations that Elizabeth Keckley. I mean, I believe she might have, because she couldn't keep her mouth shut. She was just somebody that had opinions, and I think in the privacy of I don't know if she influenced him, but she certainly, no one can know that, but I think she certainly expressed her views on things. She expressed her views on patronage. She expressed her views, I think, on slavery, and certainly on the war, about who to keep and who to hire. But I don't have anything hard that says that she influenced him on any policy issues.
Okay.
Lois, in
Michelle
our
Crow?
Lois, in our chat, we have a message from Stacy Lynn, who's
Oh,
also
yeah.
was our presenter a few months ago, and also a biographer of Mary Lincoln.
I mentioned her in my New York Times piece.
She says, "Hello again, everyone. This is Stacy Lynn from Illinois. Thanks for letting me crash this party, and thank you, Lois, for portraying Mary as a complex human. During my career in Lincoln studies, I often felt like I was screaming alone into the void.
Aw,
And it is nice to be in such good company."
that's really nice. When I wrote my op-ed piece for the New York Times, I cited three people as having done justice to Mary, three women, Ruth Painter Randall, and Baker and Stacy. And I mentioned them in the New York Times.
Okay.
A question from Michelle Crowell. What was your favorite fun fact that you discovered while researching the book?
Oh, Michelle, I wish I had thought about this. Michelle always asks the best questions. My fun fact about Mary, I don't know. I have to think about that. There were so many. Well, this is not exactly going to sound like fun, but I do admire how Mary fought back in the so-called memorial. I love this story. The memorial committee in Springfield, who tried to bully her into allowing Abe to be buried in a single tomb in Springfield, and that they thought this poor little crying widow was just going to fold. And instead, she just marshaled every strength that she had and said, "You are not putting him in that tomb. You promised me that if he was buried in Springfield, he would be with his sons, and there's no room in that tomb with his sons." And my favorite part of the story is they said, okay, but you know what? The cemetery that you want him in is not ready yet. So can we just move him here? Because the funeral train is about to come into town. And can we put him in this tomb just as a holding pattern? And Mary was smart enough to say, "Not on your life," because she knew that if those remains ever got in that tomb, they would never leave that
Never
tomb.
come out.
And
Interesting.
that's really one of my favorite
Yeah.
Mary stories, which I'm sure made her incredible stress, gave her stress. But she said she finally pulled the last card she had, which was, "If you don't stop, and if that casket is not moved to Oak Ridge, I will take the casket and move it back to Washington, and he will be buried in George Washington's crypt under the Capitol, which is empty." And that was it. Then they all caved.
Good story. Ed, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
you
This
very
was
much.
great.
Thank you very much, Lois,
Wait a
for a
minute. I
wonderful
want to get a
presentation.
commitment. I got to get a commitment. Lois, after you've seen the movie, you've got to come back and give us your review.
Well, I will do that, or at least I'll send an email to everybody and give my review. All right, I have to do that. Because people keep asking me that, and I need to do it. I intentionally didn't, and I don't think I was wrong not to do it, but I need to watch it now.
Thank you, Lois, for a wonderful
You're welcome.
presentation and another great meeting for the Lincoln Group. Thank you all, and we'll see you again in the fall.